Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see that already so many of you connected. Quick reminder that we have the chat open, and it's great to have this opportunity to study one more time in our Charizedic channels. We are going to have a wonderful evening with Rabbi Stephen Wernick, and he's going to teach us about Jewish biomedical ethics, COVID, and the allocation of resources. What a wonderful, wonderful opportunity that we have. So, just a quick reminder that, remember, you can always subscribe to all our channels, so you will always be notified every time we go live or every time we upload something to the internet. So remember, subscribe and hit the bell. That is very important if you want to be notified every time we send something your way. But now, to formally present our guest speaker tonight, we have another very important person that I'm going to invite to this session, and she is Dr. Rina Sectral-Baz. Hello, Rina. She is our Engagement and Education Director at Congregation Charizedic. Rina, welcome to the session.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's such a pleasure to be here and to have Rabbi Wernick come back to Charizedic, come back to Winnipeg. He's a childhood friend of mine, and it's really a great honor. Now, Rabbi Wernick is currently the senior rabbi and chair at Bethesda Congregation in Toronto, Ontario. He spent his youth in Winnipeg, where his father, Rabbi Eugene Wernick, was the senior rabbi at Charizedic from 1979 to 1987. And it was an amazing time with a vibrant youth movement, and Stephen was a big part of that. Rabbi Steve, as he is known to his friends, received his ordination and a Master's of Arts in Jewish Education from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in 1996. He served as associate rabbi for 7 years at Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and spent 10 years on the medical ethics committee of a local hospital in New Jersey during that time. Following this, he served for 7 years as senior rabbi in Marion Station, PA. From 2009 to 2019, Rabbi Wernick was the CEO of United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism, a very important moment in time for the movement, helping to reshape it and to get it into the future. Rabbi Wernick has held numerous board and executive committee posts and has represented the conservative movement in political and organizational roundtables around the world. He has been named to both Forward 50 and Newsweek 50 most influential rabbis and Jewish leaders. He is also married and has 3 lovely daughters, and it is a pleasure to welcome Stephen tonight. Tonight's talk is going to be first an overview and presentation of the topic, followed by a question and answer period that will be hosted by Rabbi Mass. Note that tonight is one of a series of 3 dealing with the topic of biomedical ethics, and Rabbi Mass will give you more information about that later on. If you stay to the end, I will be talking about some of our future events coming up in the next few weeks. So hang on and let's get started.
Thank you, Rina. So let's welcome Rabbi Stephen Wernick. Hello, Rabbi. Welcome
Hello,
to our
Rabbi.
session.
Hi, Rina. Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. Thank you, Rina, for this opportunity. If I can't come to Shari Tzedek in person, I suppose virtually we'll have to do. This, I suppose, all started a couple of years ago. Rina and I were both in Israel at the same time, and our mutual friend, Jennifer Helte, now Jennifer Menashe, really kind of brought us together. And the beauty of Facebook and air travel is the ability to reconnect with friends from different parts of your lives, especially when you're a wandering Jew like me, who's lived in a variety of different locations. But it's really been a pleasure to reconnect with Rina over these last couple of years. We both commented that even though it was like 30 some years since we've seen each other, it was as if no time had passed. And one of the ways that I know that Rina is one of my longstanding friends is because she calls me Stephen. That was just from a particular time of my youth. It's for me, that's the way in which I know what the relationships are. For those of you that remember me as a kid, forget about it. I'm a very different person. For those of you that are wondering how my dad is, he's doing really, really well. He's in New York. He's married. He's in great health. He's still working, and his mind is still as sharp as it ever was. So I'm happy to be here. What we're going to do is we're going to move very fast through a variety of texts. I'm going to start off first by laying some foundational principles of Jewish biomedical ethics, because if we don't have those principles, it's difficult to look at the specific question of the allocation of resources, which I noticed in today's Globe and Mail is a relevant topic. On the first page, we have an article about how doctors in Quebec and Ontario will decide who gets care in the surge of coronavirus hospitalizations if they don't subside. We know that one of the reasons why the lockdowns have increased in their stringency is because the transmission has not slowed, mostly because we human beings have, by and large, really not made good decisions in terms of social distancing and mass. And as a result of that, there's a real fear now, especially in places like Quebec, that the hospitals are going to be overrun. And if that happens, how do you determine who gets care? If you have a limited number of ventilators, if you have only X number of staff and you have Y number of people that are in need of care, you can't possibly, if you reach that tipping point, you can't possibly provide the type of care that everybody needs. And that's when the doctors and medical professionals have to really make some very difficult choices. They have to triage who's going to get care and who's not, or who's going to get care when, and what are the risks of that. It is much better from a planning perspective to have those questions answered before you get into a time of crisis. Because if you have to do it in a time of crisis, if you have to make it up while you're going, you increase the likelihood of mistakes and error. And you certainly decrease people's confidence within the decision-making process. And so these are important, relevant questions for us. But even before we get to the whole issue of the allocation of resources, we have to understand first some basic principles about biomedical ethics, and certainly from a Jewish perspective. This field of study, I was in Cherry Hill when it happened, so it's within the last 25 years. I remember that Arthur Kaplan and Paul Root Wolpe started the Department of Jewish Biomedical Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania sometime when I was in Cherry Hill. And I was very interested in the topic. And so I remember going to the second conference ever held in the world about Jewish biomedical ethics. So it's a relatively new field. And part of the reason for that, and certainly when we talk about it from a Jewish perspective, part of the reason for that is there's no question of whether or not you ought to do something if you can't do it. So the whole field of biomedical ethics really takes flight, in the last 100 years. We have certain major changes and developments, like the discovery of penicillin. But it wasn't really until the Korean War that people figured out that you could start using penicillin as part of surgical procedures. So the advent of penicillin in surgical procedures increased the success wildly of those procedures. And so, things like transplants and stem cell research and withholding of life support, all of those technologies that today, some of which are actually very common in terms of our discourse and the questions that we have to ask and the reason why we have medical directives and so forth and so on, our ancestors couldn't possibly imagine them. Medicine was, potions and herbs and maybe some palliative care. But lifespans were much shorter, and the ability of a doctor or anybody to do anything significant was very limited. So not surprisingly, we don't see huge amounts of materials that we can rely on from our tradition in terms of how we make these decisions. What we have to be willing to do is to look at the tradition and try to discern and tease out some fundamental principles that we then apply to our modern circumstance. And that, by the way, I think is really been the secret sauce of the success of the Jewish people over thousands of years, is that not only can we do that, but we've been willing to do that in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to take you through this text. So
Rabbi, before you do that, we have some very good questions on the chat, but they're all technical. People are asking if they can watch this tomorrow. Yes, it's going to stay on YouTube and Facebook. So yes, you can play it anytime you want after this session is over. And also reminder to our viewers that you can, guys, use the chat to send Rabbi Wernick your questions and your comments, and then when the time comes, he has access to the chat as well. Am I right, Rabbi?
Yes, I do. I just got to figure out how I can.
So take your time. There is nothing about the session yet, but eventually we will have the chat there. So let me go like this.
Okay. All right. Well, if I don't see the chat because I'm going through the text, Rabbi, please stop me so I can pay a little more attention to that. This is not the one. This is the one I wanted to show. Okay. Hopefully everybody is seeing this: medical ethics through a Jewish lens, fundamental principles. So I'm going to go very quickly through this so we can get to the main topic. But we can see that first and foremost is the notion of our tradition, and really for any religious tradition, that everything belongs to God. God being the creator, everything belongs to God, and everything that we benefit from in some ways, shape, or form is really on loan to us. And that's an important concept to keep in mind. And so you see that first here in Exodus and Shemot 19:5. If you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Why? Ki li kol ha'aretz, because to me, or everything, indeed, the whole earth is mine. Now, in the context of the verse, God has the ability to keep this covenant because God is God. And we see, especially when one's talking about land and the transfer of land. I mean, one of the questions we have when we read the Bible is, weren't the Canaanites already in the land? Who are the Israelites to come and get it? And the answer from the religious perspective is because God created the earth. Ki li kol ha'aretz, the entire earth belongs to me. So God can decide which nation is going to occupy what land at what time. And so we see that there. That gets emphasized again in the Psalms, as you can see in this fourth text from Tehillim, LeDavid mizmor ladonai ha'aretz umlo'ah, of David, a psalm. The earth is the Lord's, and everything that fills it, everything that's there. Tevel v'yoshveva, the world and its many inhabitants. God owns everything. Another example is found in the Midrash of Vayikra Rabbah, and here we get a sense of the consequence of God owning everything in the land, because God is the creator. And I'm gonna work through the English. for this because it's a long passage in the Hebrew. But this is the story of Hillel, the elder, Rabbi Hillel, who's taking a walk. And he's leaving his students. And they said to him, "Rabbi, where are you walking to?" And he said to them, "To fulfill the commandment." And they said to him, "And what commandment is this?" He said to them, "To bathe in the bathhouse." They said to him, "But is this really a commandment? Where in the Torah does it say that one is commanded to bathe?" To which Hillel responds, "Yes, just like regarding the statues, the icons of kings that are set up in theaters and circuses, the one who is appointed over them bathes and scrubs them and gives them sustenance. And furthermore, he attains status with the leaders of the kingdom." Right? So the analogy that he's giving is that we have these statues that belong to the king, and there's people whose responsibility it is to keep the statues in pristine condition. So too, he says, was I created B'Tselem Elohim, in the divine image and form. And so therefore, I have an obligation to bathe. Right? And so here we get, really one of the earliest hints of our tradition, that we have an obligation to keep our bodies in working order, and that bathing is one of them. Now, of course, one of the reasons why this is even more significant is that the Romans were the ones who really invented the bathhouse. Of course, people bathed, probably infrequently. The Romans did it even more often. And so the fact that you have Hillel, the elder, Rabbi Hillel, probably going to a Roman bathhouse is significant. So important is this mitzvah of bathing, of taking care of the body, that he would go even to a Roman bathhouse. And here in the Mishnah Torah, which is a work of halakha by Maimonides, we see even taking this idea of responsibility for the body, taking it further. Here, it starts with, it's necessary for a person to set his heart and all this effort solely to know the name, to know God's name, blessed be God, so that sitting down and rising up and his speech shall all be facing this goal. And how does one accomplish this? When he will buy or sell or do work for wages, he should not have in his heart the accumulation of money only, but he should perform these duties as a means to acquire the necessities of the body, food, drink, dwelling place, and marriage. So the first lesson here is that the reason that we work is not just because we want to acquire money, but more so because we need to acquire things that allow us to live, and to live with dignity, such as food, drink, a home, and family life. Likewise, it goes on, when a person eats, drinks, or leads a family life, person should not set his heart upon these things for the sole enjoyment thereof, meaning you can't be a glutton. Just because you're allowed food and drink, a house and marriage, doesn't mean that you necessarily should go off the reservation for it. You shouldn't do so. And even Maimonides goes further, like as a consequence, if you do that, you'll not eat or drink except for that which is sweet. Or you might marry to gratify sensuality only, but not for love. But rather, he should set his heart to eat and drink solely in order to keep his body and limbs in good health. And that's really the point that's here. Maimonides is taking this notion from the Midrash about bathing, and he's taking it one step further. He's saying that moderation is the key. That we need to eat. We have certain urges to eat, to drink, for procreation, and so forth. But we shouldn't. But we do so only really to keep our body and our limbs in good health. And he goes a little further. He has a little fun with this. He says, you should not eat everything in your palate that you crave for, like a dog or a donkey or an ass, but partake in those things which are wholesome for the body, whether bitter or sweet. Not eat food which is bad for the body, even though it be sweet to the palate. Right. So if you're looking for guidance on a healthy diet, and the importance of taking care of your body, both in terms of bathing and in terms of the food that you eat, and everything else. Here you have it in the 10th, 11th century from Maimonides, who's putting it in the Mishnah Torah, which is a code of Jewish law. He's saying actually that it's not just something that you should do, but taking on the idea of Hillel a couple 800 years earlier, taking on the idea of Hillel, Maimonides is basically saying this is the halakha, this is the law. I want to show you just a couple more as it relates to this. All of this, comes back to as its original source, which one of those sources is here in Vayikra. Ushmartem et chukakai vet mishputai asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem. You shall keep my laws and my rules, the pursuit of which a person shall live. Meaning that our obligation is to live, and we have to do those things that maintain our life. And so this becomes a fundamental principle. We're created in the image and likeness of God. Everything on the earth belongs to God, including our bodies. It's on loan. And because we're commanded to live and not to die, therefore also we see these traditions in the text in which we have to maintain our bodies and moderate our food and our drink and our other urges. And in this verse from the Gemara, from the Talmud and Avodah Zarah, we see a proof text for that biblical idea taken to this extent in Babylonia in the 5th century. What does it mean that you should live by them? One should live by God's mitzvot and not die from them. And this also becomes the proof text for the halakha that saving a life, pikuach nefesh tochefet hakol, the preservation of life pushes aside all the other mitzvot, including Shabbat. So the violation of Shabbat, for example, is punished by death, according to tradition. But if you're violating Shabbat in order to preserve a life, you can do so because the commandment is to live by them and not die by them. And so the mitzvot are designed to be a framework for creating habits of holiness, but those habits of holiness must be pushed aside in order for the preservation of life. Because as the psalmist says elsewhere, lo hametim tahalal yah, the dead do not worship God. And so therefore the imperative is to live. A couple more, I kind of hinted at this already, but human worth stems from being created in the divine image. Of course, the source for this is Bereshit. Chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, we're created in the image and likeness of God. And then all the other texts really, in some way, shape, or form, are riffing off of that. I want to share with you the Mishnah from Sanhedrin, which is this Mishnah here, chapter 4, verse 5. The Mishnah was codified by the rabbis around the year 200, 250 CE. It's the first code of Jewish law, and it represents the transition of the authority of Jewish life from the Beit Mikdash, from the temple and the Kohanim, the priests, to the rabbis, from the Beit Mikdash to the Beit Midrash, from the temple to the academy. In this text, it's discussing the verse that found in Bereshit about Cain and Abel, where God says to Cain after he has killed Abel, and he gives him an opportunity to try to come clean with his crime. And of course, Cain responds famously, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? To which the answer, of course, is, yes, you are. You are your brother's keeper. But then God goes on, he says, the bloods of your brother cry out to you. And so the rabbis are riffing on that, and you can see it here on the third line of what I'm showing. The bloods of your brother cry out. It doesn't say the blood of your brother, but rather the bloods of your brother in the plural, meaning the blood and the blood of his descendants. So here the idea is that when you kill someone, you murder someone, or you allow someone to die, not only their blood, but the blood of their future descendants are on you, right? You have an obligation for that. Another saying is the bloods of your brother means that his blood was cast over trees and stones. Therefore, but a single person was created in the world, to teach that if any man caused a single life to perish from Israel, he is deemed by Scripture as if he caused the whole world to perish. This is the saying that was made famous by Schindler's List. Steven Spielberg chose it to be at the end of the list, at the end of the movie, rather, that he who saves a single life, it's as if they saved the world entire. And so the idea is that human life is of infinite value, and its infinite value derives from the fact that we're created in the image and likeness of God. So God creates the entire world. Everything belongs to God, and human beings are created in God's image, and therefore human life has infinite worth. And it goes on. I think this is a very important topic for today, in Canada as well as in terms of the United States, with regard to the artificial distinctions we human beings make against each other based on skin and disabilities and ability and sexuality and so forth and so on. This is the famous saying, why was a single person, a single Adam, created? In order for us not to say to one another that my father was greater than your father, because we all come from the same father. What makes God really God is that when we stamp a coin, every coin looks the same, but when God casts the die, every human being looks different. Now I want to just go back for a moment and show you that verse in Bereshit, because it's essential to this understanding. And I'm going to work in the Hebrew here at the top of the page. Vayomer Elohim na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. God says, let us make Adam in our image and our likeness. So Adam here is probably not a first name. It's not Adam. It's Adam, meaning a human being. It's only later in chapter 2 that Adam becomes a proper name, which leads to all sorts of biblical criticism as to the weaving together of the narrative of the Bible. But let's make God in our image after our likeness. And then verse 27, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. Here, for sure, you know it's a noun and not a pronoun, because if it was a pronoun, you wouldn't have the hey before Adam. You wouldn't say the Adam. It's just Adam. So Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. So God creates the human being. B'tzalmo b'tzem Elohim bara oto. In the image and likeness of God, God created oto, it. Zachar Nikeva bara otam, male and female, God created them. So here it seems that the original Adam was androgynous, and had both perhaps male and female characteristics that were later separated. Certainly, it could also be read that God created human being, male and female. God created them, but humanity is B'Tselem et ha'adam, right? It's human beings that are created, and that's what allows the Midrash and the Mishnah to riff on it in the way in which it does. Everything belongs to God. Human beings are holy and are sacred, because we are made in God's image and likeness. Now, in terms of medicine and doctors, the tradition has a variety of different perspectives about this. As I said, there's no question of whether you ought to do something if you can't do it. And certainly for the time of the rabbis and the time of the Bible, there was very little that human beings could do. Why is this numbering off? Oh, that's why. And so I'm going to just show a couple examples of that. So here you have a text from Kiddushin. This is also from the Talmud. This is, for those of you who are doctors, this is not going to be a great comment about doctors. And again, you just have to take it in context. So a person may not teach his son the trades of a donkey driver, a camel driver, a pot maker, sailor, shepherd, or a storekeeper. The reason for all these is the same as their trades are the trades of robbers, meaning that the tradition did not think kindly upon these trades. All of those professions involve a measure of dishonesty and are likely to lead to robbery, meaning there's something about them where the weights are not properly calibrated. Rabbi Yehuda says in Abu Guraya's name, most donkey drivers are wicked, and most camel drivers are of fit character. Most sailors are pious. And the best of doctors is to Gehenna, and even the fittest of butchers is a partner of Amalek. So the best of doctors are basically, resigned to hell. Because certainly in this time, why would you go see a doctor? There's not much doctors could do except for give you, as I said, a potion. And so for this part of the Talmud, we see that doctors are not considered to be of worthy profession. But yet, you have in Exodus chapter 21 verses 19 you have in Exodus this verse v'rapeh yerapeh, that God will surely heal you. And so the question of the Talmud always is why is there a repetition or an emphasis of the root resh pei aleph to heal? And the reason that's a problem is because the Torah, if it's divine, God's not going to mince words. Every word's got to have meaning. And so here we have a comment from Ibn Ezra, an Italian commentator from the 13th century, who says that the reason you see the repetition, the emphasis of the word to heal, is a sign that God gave permission to physicians to heal plagues and wounds that are visible on the outside of the body. Healing that's on the inside of the body is only for the hand of God to heal. So Ibn Ezra in Italy in the 13th century has a different perspective than the Talmud in the 5th century. For Ibn Ezra already, there are doctors that are on the field. There's been advances in medical science. Rambam certainly was a doctor from the 10th, 11th century, 200 years before that. But yet, there's still a differentiation that is drawn between illnesses on the inside and things that are visible. And it was an understanding of what doctors were capable of doing. They couldn't get a new artery. They didn't have the ability to do that. But perhaps there were herbs and potions and medicines that could be applied to either reduce plagues or to bind wounds. Let's see. I'll go to one last text here of these fundamental principles. This is the last one that I put together in this particular worksheet. Here, this is a more modern understanding. Rabbi Akiva began, humankind, its days are like grass. That's from Tehillim, from Psalms. There was an incident with Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva who were taking a walk in the outskirts of Jerusalem, and there was a person with them. A sick person encountered them, and he said to them, "My masters, tell me what I can be cured with." So Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva are taking a walk. They're outside of Jerusalem, and a sick person comes up to him and says, "How can I be cured?" And they said to him, "Do this and that, and you're cured. Take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning." And this person comes to them, "But who's stricken me? Why am I sick?" It's because God, blessed be God, said, made me sick. Obviously, if all things belong to God, then my sickness must be in some way, shape, or form a test, a punishment, a reward, something that God has caused. And Ishmael and Akiva say to him, "Have you intruded yourself in a matter that doesn't belong to you? God has stricken and you heal. Are you not transgressing against his will?" Meaning, this is what the person is saying to Akiva and to Ishmael. "How can you tell me to heal myself? If you do that, wouldn't that be transgressing God's will?" And here's a wonderful argument. They said to him, "Excuse me, sir, what do you do for a living?" He said, "I'm a farmer. I'm a farm worker. And, and I see the sickles in my hand." And they said, "Well, who created the vineyard?" He said to them, "God." They said to him, "And you've intruded yourself in a matter that doesn't belong to you? God created it and you cut your fruits from it?" It's a wonderful analogy here. God creates the earth. God creates the vineyard. Who are you to prune it, to cut it, to water it, to tend to the vineyard? He says, "Don't you see the sickle in my hand? If I don't go out and plow and cover and fertilize and prune it, it would produce nothing at all." And they said to him, "Fool, the same is true about humankind. Our days are just like as grass, just as the tree. If it's not pruned and fertilized and plowed, it won't come up. And if it comes up and doesn't drink water, it's not fertilized, it will not live, but will die. So also with the body." The point being that, yes, everything belongs to God. God created us, but also we have an obligation to take care of it. But what you see in the fundamental principles, as I said, is is everything belongs to God. Is human beings, our value is of divine worth, and we have an obligation to take care of it. And the thrust of taking care of it is really towards shleimut. If we look through other sources within this batch, what we would see is that our tradition understood the intersection of mind, body, and soul, of having shleimut, of living with well-being, is really the best way to put it. And nevertheless, as I said, there's an ambivalence about the role of doctors. And that ambivalence is due to the fact that medical technology in our tradition was lacking, to say the least. I'm going to take a pause there and see if there are any questions that people have about those fundamental principles. Rabbi, was there anything in the chat that I missed?
Not really, except, well, we have a, this is interesting because it's not specifically a question about ethics or anything like that, but you will love this one. This is from Diane and Ed Winters.
Oh, hi, Diane and Ed. We used to live behind you, or used to live. Oh no, that's actually somebody else. But I remember you. I think your daughter's still in touch with Sarah, if I remember correctly. Be sure to contact me. You can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter, or Instagram. I'm like all over the place.
So far we have no questions for.
All right.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So if you want to bring back your screen.
So I'll bring back my screen.
Unless Adrina, do you have a question?
I do. It's more of a comment. You were talking about, Rabbi, you were talking about the importance of looking after the body at all costs. And you may be talking about this later on, but there's been a lot of criticism about certain elements in our community where they haven't been looking after the body first, and gatherings are continuing even in light of the pandemic. And it doesn't seem to me that that would be the Jewish way.
Well, so that's a great segue to the next series of texts, because we'll see very clearly in our tradition that the behavior that doesn't pay attention to the impact of a plague and public health advisories is a chilul Hashem. Is a desecration of God's name, and it's actually quite. You'll see in a moment. It's quite striking how plain that is, right? I mean, you can't be more specific than what the text is going to say.
It seems to go against everything you've said so far.
Yeah, right. Which it's astonishing. From a religious perspective, it's astonishing when religious people don't pay attention to this. Here in Canada, COVID is devastating too, but in the US, there's over 400,000 people that have died. It's more people in 10 months than all the wars combined since World War II. There's 4,100 people dying a day. 3,000 people died on 9/11. A little more than 3,000, 3,400, I think, died in Pearl Harbor. Right? They're dying a day. And the science is clear that mass physical distancing, washing your hands regularly, can slow the spread of this disease. It's astonishing to me how religious people can ignore this.
I mean, Netilat Yadayim has never seemed so relevant.
Well, we'll see that too. Although, Netilat Yadayim has two reasons attached to it, but we'll see that in the text as well. But the second reason is related to that, and it's probably a byproduct of washing our hands before we eat. It's not that Jews are necessarily more healthy than other people, or that our traditions are more healthy than other religious traditions. But it's that we do have certain traditions, like washing our hands, to elevate ourselves like the Kohanim, like the priests, for which perhaps an unintended consequence or outcome was better health. Margaret's asking a question about teaching to doctors. I used to teach this to doctors when I was on the medical ethics committee at the Kennedy Health Centers in South Jersey. I used to teach this to doctors, to nurses, to other people that are there. The major, most religious traditions, at least the normative religious traditions, show, are similar in their outcome. We know that there are some, like Christian Scientists, for example, that take the verse from Exodus quite literally, that only God can heal. And so they discount medical science at all. I would say, I would just say that that's crazy, frankly. The church, certainly all the mainline Christian, mainstream Christian traditions, mainline Islam, Hindu, Buddhists, they all understand that we're partners and that we have a role to play in achieving shleimut and achieving well-being. Different ways of going about it, different ways in which it gets expressed, differences of opinions over organ donation and reproduction in particular. But in terms of the preservation of life, yes. Just one quick example, even the preservation of life is at the essence of the abortion debate. If you're Catholic, you believe that life begins when conception has happened. And so if that's the moment in which a human being gains its soul, then you can't abort it, because aborting it would be murder. Jewish tradition believes that life begins when the baby takes its first breath. God breathed the breath of life into Adam. And so we relate linshom, to breathe, with neshama, with soul. And so breathing is how you get your soul. So an embryo, a fetus, has the potential for human life and should be treated with dignity, as all life, not animal life, human life, all life should be treated with dignity. But if it's a choice between the existing life of the mother and the potential life of the fetus, our tradition is very clear. Not only may you abort, but in those circumstances where the preservation of the life of the mother is at stake, you must abort. That would be the mitzvah. Maimonides added to that. Again, Maimonides was a doctor. He added to that criteria also the mental health well-being of the mother. Maimonides, 700 years before Freud, was already diagnosing melancholia. And so he added to that the mental health of the mother. And then the halakha tries to figure out, well, how do you determine what the mental health of the mother is? Because there is a fear that, people will say, I can't deal with the baby, or financial reasons, or so forth and so on. And there was a fear that mental health would possibly be abused. So you see a lot of discussion in our tradition as to what would constitute a legitimate mental health reason for abortion. But there's no question in our tradition about abortion for preservation of the life of the mother. It's not even, as I said, it's not an option. It would be mandated in our tradition. So yes, that's normative tradition, but I don't pretend to know the details of the ethical approaches to medicine of my colleagues. I only really spent my time studying this. So let me take you through a couple of the issues concerning resource allocation, which is a very real issue. Fortunately, both in New York, where they were very, very close, and even in Italy, where it was devastating in the beginning of the pandemic, and here in Quebec and Canada, I mean, we're thinking about it and we're planning for it. But in Quebec, there's 130 patients right now in the ICU units. And if they get to 200, then they would put these criteria into place. So there's still quite a ways to go. But the mere fact that they're thinking about it just shows how bad the circumstances are concerning our sources. Now, our sources certainly knew from plague. Plagues are not new. We have, of course, the famous 10 plagues of the Torah, of the Exodus story, of the Haggadah. We can see also in Exodus 12:23, Adonai will pass through, become revealed to plague the Egyptians, and God will send the blood on the lintel. We'll see the blood on the lintel, 2 side posts, and Adonai will then pass over. Now, one of the things that I love about this is that Bnei Yisrael, the Israelites, had to take a proactive step in order to save themselves. God wasn't just going to save them. They had to take the blood of a lamb rather, and put it on their lintels, which was a huge risk for them, because the lamb was a preferred sacrifice of Egyptian society. And if God didn't come and bring that plague, then they would have been easily identified by the Egyptians in terms of where they would have brought their revenge. So here you have, another example. Bnei Yisrael has to do something. They have an obligation to play a part in their own redemption. In this case, to save themselves from the plague, they have to put blood on the doorposts. In Vayikra, we have the issue of leprosy, which wasn't really leprosy, but some sort of skin disease that was highly contagious. And the Kohen is the doctor. V'ra'ahu haKohen bayom hashvi'i et pasa tifseh ba'or. So on the seventh day, the priest shall examine him, and if it had spread onto the skin, if it spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's a leprous affection. And so clearly, in the Bible, they knew about plagues. And here in Leviticus 13, you see more about that. In Bamidbar, in Numbers, Vayidbar Adonai el Moshe lemor, God speaks to Moses saying, instruct all the Israelites to remove from the camp anyone with an eruption or a discharge, anyone defiled by a corpse, male and female, anybody who's defiled, you got to get them out. And the Israelites did so, putting them outside the camp as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So here, there's an understanding of quarantine, basically, that those people that have any kind of anything that spreads, the ancients understood that they needed to be quarantined. And in the previous text that I showed, after 7 days, if whatever the ailment is has cured, if the person is able to return to the camp, they would go back to the camp. If not, they'd have to wait another 7 days. And so these ideas of quarantine and 7 days, 2 weeks, they're not new, not by a long shot. Also, again, the ancient world, there's some ambivalence as to whether or not these things come from God. And if they come from God, as we see in Deuteronomy here, if they come from God, are they in some way, shape, or form a punishment? There's some texts that say, I'm reading this now. I have a class, we're studying the Talmud of Barachot, of blessings. And in the opening pages of Barachot, in the first 10 dapim, there's this whole conversation about God, giving people challenges for their own good, for their betterment. There's a question from Ariel Lee, I'm sorry. I've heard that Manitoba politicians who travel for personal reasons when the rest of the people were told to stay home in December holidays, they were given preference. This has not been revealed by the government. What would Jewish ethics about publicly elected officials jumping the queue? So on the question about public officials jumping the queue, the question is that the answer is really about whether or not they're essential workers. One could argue that certain politicians and public officials, for sure would be essential workers. But that's really the question. I mean, from the Jewish tradition, it's going to be about who's essential, and the triage is going to be related to that. So I'm gonna move a little bit faster. There's another question. How does about circumcision? Circumcision is as a Jewish must. It is the sign of the covenant, and so every understanding of Jewish tradition that I'm aware of and that I know would maintain circumcision as an essential mitzvah. And there's a legitimate question to be asked about the training and supervision of mo'alim. That I think is an essential question. In New York, there was a whole issue about mitzitza b'peh, which was this ancient practice of putting a tube on the circumcision, and the mohel brings it up by inhaling. It doesn't actually do it so much that he consumes the blood, but there was a whole question about that practice in the Haredi circles, and whether or not that was something that should be outlawed or not. So that's that. Ariel, I see your comment there. I'm not in a position to comment more about who the politicians were, what they were or not doing. Only from the Jewish ethical perspective, essential workers would be first. Let me. Here's the text that speaks to Rena's question. This is from the Talmud in Baba Kama, and you can see it plain as day here in the Hebrew and the English, or the Aramaic, Hebrew and English. Tanu Rabbanan, they just taught, if there is plague in the city, gather your feet, limit the time you spend out of the house, as it is stated in the verse, and none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until morning. And it says in another verse, come, my people, enter into your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourself for a little moment until the anger has passed by. Right? Again, plagues were considered to be anger, God's anger. As it says, outside the sword will bereave, meaning if you go outside, you will be killed, you will die. And in the chambers, terror, meaning that we're all frightened being in our houses because of that. But so here you have it like plain as day, right? If there's a plague in the city, stay home. I don't know how a tradition could say it any more plainly than that. Stay home. And in fact, there's a text in it's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, where there was a plague in 1587, I think it was, in Berlin, and the question was, how do you make a minyan if there's a plague and you have to follow this halakha of staying home? And the answer that they gave is that if you live in a courtyard, you can open your windows, stick your head out, and if one person leads and everybody can see each other and hear the person davening, such that you can say Amen, then you can have a minyan. Now again, our ancestors didn't know from Zoom, but Zoom is the same thing, right? It simulates exactly that. It has windows, and it has a voice. And so in Shat Dachak, in a time of emergency, when we have to stay home, I, like many other progressive rabbis, even some Orthodox rabbis, have ruled that it is permissible to daven in a Zoom minyan. Okay, let me.
So, Rina, you had a question?
Well, my question was an extension of what you've just mentioned. And is there some provision for making people not feel isolated? So they're not allowed to gather, but is there something that's said to enable them to see others that would allow for the Zoom gatherings or the live streaming of services?
So the only truly analogous text is the one that I just said about the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and davening in the courtyard. But I would imagine, halakha doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It didn't end in 1537 with the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, if you're Jews and you're observant, then you're asking these questions all the time, and our knowledge and technology impacts the way in which we respond to them. I mean, this is the reason why I'm a conservative Jew, because conservative Judaism has a fidelity to halakha, but it understands halakha as something that is evolving, and has to respond to the generation in which it exists. So I can't for the life of me imagine, I think it's totally reasonable in this circumstance that we use technology like this, even on Shabbat and holidays. as long as, the way in which we dealt with it at Bet Tzedek, which is a more traditional synagogue, is we didn't use technology on Shabbat or holidays until Shavuot, when it became clear that this was a marathon and not a sprint. And during the week, we use Zoom, which can simulate people being together as a minyan. On Shabbat and holidays, we don't use Zoom. We only live stream because we don't want to ask. It's possible on the live stream to set up your computer so that when the live stream starts, it starts automatically. And the receiver, the viewer, doesn't have to do anything if you do that. So we wanted to have an opportunity for people to still have a sense of this spirit of Shabbat, even though they were looking at their computer screen. And so Zoom doesn't allow you to do that, really. But a live stream does. And so we hired non-Jewish staff, and we invested a whole ton of money in equipment in order to get that. Let me, I'm seeing a question about the criteria for triage. So let's get to that because that's really most effective. But here you can see on washing hands. I'll just quickly say on washing hands, if you see the Mishnah Brura, which is Epstein, it's 19th century halakha. It's designed to be a kitzor, an easy guide for halakha. You can see that he brings the tradition together in a code that the rabbis required us to wash our hands for two reasons. One is to be in a good habit for truma, that when the Kohanim would eat the truma, would eat the tithe that was given to them, they had to wash their hands, and they couldn't touch something impure because then they wouldn't be able to eat truma. So we wash our hands. We want the Kohanim to stay in this habit and to wash their hands so that they'll constantly be able to eat truma. So all of us wash our hands before we eat because we want to be dugmaot we want to be examples for the Kohanim. And then the second reason given is for cleanliness and holiness. Now the cleanliness here is not health cleanliness, it's about purity. It relates to the Kohanim and holiness. So make yourselves holy and be holy. The rabbis read that everybody should act like Kohanim, so therefore everybody should wash their hands. So an outcome of these two reasons for washing our hands on a regular basis is that we not only washed away impurities, but we also washed away whatever dirt and bacteria may have been on our hands. And that, of course, an unintended consequence was probably healthier living and less disease when it came. All right, onto the criteria for triage. Here we see in the Shulchan Aruch, Tzfat, Yosef Karo, 15th, 16th century. There's no equivalent, of course, for medical triage. We have to look at the other examples that our tradition knew and then take from that and apply it to the modern circumstance. So here in the Shulchan Aruch, you see that if many poor people seek help and there's not enough money in the treasury to help them all, meaning you're dealing with a circumstance where there's great unemployment and a lot of poverty, and there's not enough money in the tzedakah box, in the community tzedakah box, to give money to everybody. How do you do it? Well, according to the Shulchan Aruch, the Kohen is given preference before a Levite, and a Levite before an ordinary Yisrael, and an ordinary Yisrael before a Halal. A Halal is somebody who is the child of a marriage that's forbidden to priests. And then a halal before a child of unknown fatherhood, a foundling before mamzer, a mamzer before nathin, which is a descendant of the Gibeonites, and a natin before a proselyte before an emancipated slave. And this only applies in cases where they're equal in learning, meaning the proselyte and the emancipated slave when they're equal in learning. But between a bastard and a scholar and a high priest and ignoramus, the scholarly bastard is given the preference. And whoever is greater in learning is preferred, which of course is not surprising because this is written by rabbis. So they preferred themselves above everybody else. and then if the father or the teacher of the charity distributor is among the poor seeking aid, the teacher or the father, provided he to his scholars, given preference, even if there's a far greater scholar among them. So here you see a triage from the Great Code of Jewish Life, the Shulchan Aruch, of what you do when there's not enough money to go around. Another place in the Shulchan Aruch, we have this text, which is helping one's grown-up sons or daughters in need when he's not obligated to do so. So your children are in need; they're grown-ups, so you're no longer obligated to do them, to provide for them. They're no longer minors. They should be off the payroll, but they're having problems, right? So what's the triage? In order to give his sons an opportunity for studying the law or to keep his daughters in the right path. So if your son is asking for help because he wants to become a rabbi, you got to help him. Or if your daughters are perhaps going down the wrong path, you need to keep them on the right path. And presenting gifts to one's father in need. All this comes under the general heading of tzedakah. And so you can see a different type of triage there. And then here there's an authority that holds that the synagogue is more important than charity. That meaning that if the choice is between charity or building a synagogue, you should build the synagogue before the charity. But maintaining poor boys in the study of law, supporting sick people is more important than the maintenance of a synagogue, except for keeping people studying Torah. Clearly, the rabbis have a bias for the studying of Torah. They were rabbis, so they're obviously they viewed rabbinic study as the essence of living a meaningful Jewish life, and so they would say that they above everybody else. But here, and when talking about the choice of building a synagogue or doing something else, sick poor people rather, are more important. Maimonides, even before that, would also say that redeeming captives is more important than building a synagogue. And part of that was just practical. In his time, it was not uncommon for the king to kidnap influential people within their communities and hold them for ransom against the Jews. Here you have another triage. Feeding the hungry should precede clothing the naked. Because if you can't eat, there's no point in being clothed, right? Your body can survive 3 days without food. So if you don't have food, you don't need clothing. So if you have to choose between feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, feeding hungry takes place. If a man and a woman ask for food, the woman is given preference, and so too if they ask for clothing. So also if two orphans, a man and a woman, come to be married off, the woman is given precedence. There's a whole discussion about why the woman should have preference and precedence, and it's mostly to keep her from being vulnerable and being used and abused literally from unworthy characters. There's also, when it comes to food, this is the only act of tzedakah for which there's no due diligence that is required. If somebody comes to you and says they're hungry, you're supposed to feed them. You're not supposed to check to see if they're really hungry. When it comes to giving tzedakah to any other purpose, one, according to our tradition, is not only able but should do their due diligence and make sure that their tzedakah money is really going to help those that are in need. Here we have the Shulchan Aruch taking Maimonides' ransom captives before feeding and clothing the poor, because that was a big problem. And what the Shulchan Aruch does here is that if you don't ransom them, if you delay, it's as if you were shedding their blood, because of course their lives were at stake.
Rabbi, can I ask you two questions about this?
Please.
So there's two things that you mentioned. One was looking after the most vulnerable. So in a triage, would the most vulnerable come first? And then it also made me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where the physiological needs need to be met first. So is there something with that as far as deciding who gets looked after first as well?
Well, yes.
Because it doesn't seem like learning. I mean, I know that learning is important, but if you're dying of hunger, how can you learn?
Well, that's so. Look, that's why the Shulchan Aruch says that feeding the hungry, even that it's that feeding the hungry and supporting poor people doing scholarship are the top two priorities. Right, feeding the hungry would take precedence. If you had to choose between feeding the hungry and supporting students, I think the tradition would say you feed the hungry.
Okay. So the most vulnerable first, and physiological needs over intellectual needs. Then, would you say?
Well, right. Look again. Loa metim tahalel yah. Right. The dead don't worship God. So if you're dead, you can't study Torah.
No.
Right. I mean, this is why, like, the whole argument over opening the economy or dealing with the virus is dumb, because there is no economy if people are dead.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. That the two are linked. There's no economy if people are dying. And so the only way to have a robust economy is to bring the virus under control. Right now, yes. I mean, are there ways that you can hopefully do both? Yes, but it requires good messaging, good decisions. Things that, I mean, we can look south of the border for like a terrible example for last year about how all this was handled. But even here, right, it's like, what's going on with the vaccine distribution? How come there's not a plan yet? Do we have enough vaccines for everybody? And what's going on with now that Pfizer is like delaying it a week? Here in Ontario, Premier Ford issued a stay-at-home order that went into effect on Boxing Day, which is like, but Boxing Day wasn't the super spreader event; it was Christmas, right? So,
Well, that's right.
right. But there's no economy if people are dying, right? And so that's why the tradition is very clear about this. If there's a plague, you stay home, because they didn't know anything else to do except for to isolate people, right? They didn't have vaccines. They didn't necessarily understand mass and viral transmissions and droplets versus aerosol, and they didn't know any of that. We know that now, right? So to answer the question about Quebec and really all of this for what's the triage in terms of care. First and foremost, I would say it would be medical professionals. If you don't have enough doctors, if you don't have enough nurses, if you don't have enough technicians, nobody's going to get better, right? So and I would also say, like, exactly what we've been talking about, like, the people that are working in the grocery stores, and in all those essential services that we've taken for granted before, they are the most courageous people in the world. They're still showing up for work. Many of them probably taking the bus, which isn't the safest way to get there. So it's definitely, it would be, the triage would be medical professionals. But then the question becomes, is like, well, the patients, like, how do you deal with patients who come? And there you have, exactly as said as in the paper, if you run out of resources, you really have only three options. One option is a first come, first serve basis, which is totally unfair, and would bring, for sure, a lot of extra deaths with it. Because just because you're first come, first serve doesn't mean necessarily you're going to survive the treatment. A second option is a pure lottery option, Now, both of those options are morally indefensible, right? So the third option, which is the really hard one, and if you're a medical professional and you have to make this choice, it's like a zoe, right? And
Yeah.
that's with you try your very best to come up with criteria that can be applied consistently and explicitly based on evidence, in which you want to give the people who have the best chance of actually surviving the treatment the opportunity to do so. And the people who have the least chance of surviving it, unfortunately, that's a tough choice. Now, this is why it's really important, and to have these plans in advance, because you don't want to be making this stuff up on the way that you're doing it. And what they said in the paper, which is certainly the practice that I was taught, is that every patient should be blind, meaning that you look at them based on the evidence, not on the name, which from a
Right.
medical professional is the opposite of what you're trained, right? You're trained as a doctor to see the whole person, there.
Mhm.
So you don't want to do that in this case, because you
Right.
don't want to have that kind of influence at play. And then you want to have two doctors and an ethicist that are therefore advising. So the treating physician would have to fill out these forms, and then the panel of two other doctors and the medical ethicists are looking at them blindly. They're looking at the evidence, and they're trying to determine which of these patients has the best chance of long-term survival.
But that would mean that we are not looking after the most vulnerable first. We're looking after the strongest first,
Well,
which is the total opposite of what we actually were.
what we're talking about, though, a crisis circumstance where there's not enough resources to go around. Where there's
it's time
enough resources to go around, everybody gets treated.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
But
basically what it's saying is you treat first the one that you believe is going to survive after treatment.
yes.
That will be a more positive way of putting it, I believe.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't have to do with age then. We're not saying
It doesn't have to
the
do with age.
people are like,
It
okay,
doesn't have to do with age.
But it's all about, you see, what I
It might,
hear.
though. I mean, it depends on what the crisis is.
Yeah, but then you need experts, right? And I think one of the problems is people are not listening to experts anymore. And that's another problem, that we don't know where to go. Well, I believe I do, but most people feel like they're totally lost. They don't know who to believe.
Well, we're living in a time in which the ability to manipulate information is at its highest, and that's degraded our trust in all institutions, especially government, and also in some places of the world, experts. But as I said, it's like, Canada has certainly done a much better job than the U.S. in terms of this. But still, you can point to, it doesn't matter which party, but you just got to scratch your head and wonder, like, these are political decisions, not medical decisions. And that's the problem. I see that somebody asked a question about Israel being the world leader in vaccinations, and yeah, that's. Unfortunately, that's because Israel has a lot of experience in national emergencies. If you're in a country that goes to war as often as Israel does, and has had to shelter its people for as long as they've had to do that when missiles are flying, Israel has a very, very sophisticated civil administration. And that's because they've had to do that. So they've been able to tap into that system for the distribution of the vaccines. And as a result of that, I think today the number was 40% of the population has been vaccinated so far, and it's actually higher, because 16-year-olds and younger are not eligible for the vaccine. So if you take them out of the picture, it's almost 60% of the eligible Israeli citizens. And I want to stress, because there's been some falsehoods about this, Israeli citizens, people living in Israel proper are getting the vaccine. Palestinian, Arab, Jewish, Christian, it doesn't matter. It's 60% of them. Israel's under no obligation to see to the vaccinations of Gaza or the Palestinian Authority. And what the Israeli authorities that have spoken to me have said about this, as well as what I've read, is that if they were asked, they would certainly assist. But that's just one of the fallacies that's going on.
It's important that you said that, Rabbi, because we've had a lot of politicians make false declarations, and it's been quite harmful.
Yeah. So Bonnie talks about the protocols similar to what Saskatchewan's proposed. Well, that's not surprising. Saskatchewan created socialized medicine in Canada, so I would just imagine that they would always be ahead of the curve on this. But yeah, I mean, like, what I'm describing is it's really not. It's not anything new in the sense of new this time. I mean, many of these protocols, and this is the great shame of it all, right? I mean, the booklets were all created after the SARS virus. I mean, it's all there, and yet governments, which never plan too far to the future and always thinking about the next election, they really, all of them, have let their citizens down, because it's been known for quite some time that there would be another virus. And what we don't appreciate is there have been 17 pandemics in the last 20 years. They just haven't really hit North America. As long as it's happening in Africa, we don't tend to pay attention all that much.
Yeah.
But we've known, right? You look at the stuff we've known, and the biomedical ethicists have been talking about this for a long time. As I said, the Jewish biomedical ethics has only been 25 years.
So, Rabbi, would you say that triaging in Canada is in line with the halachic philosophy of triaging?
Yes, I would say that it is. I'd say that some provinces are further along than others. Quebec seems to be quite detailed. Saskatchewan, I've heard, is as well. Ontario is only right now is in general terms and not in specific terms. It needs to get specific. But the overall values that are being applied in Western nations when it comes to triage are very much in line with halakha, certainly as I understand the halakha.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe a lot of that's because of the number of Jews that are involved in medicine. I don't know. It could be.
Yeah.
So let's see if we have any more questions in the chat. Remember, everyone, we are receiving messages.
Oh, Bonnie's comment here about the physicians being from different regions connect via the internet. I think that's great. That would certainly limit the potential for undue influence. And it's really no different than what happens with radiology today, right? I mean, you could take an X-ray or an MRI. You could have somebody in Israel or India reading it. I mean, we're using technology like this all the time. That would make perfect sense to do that in these cases as well. So thank you for sharing that. Any other questions? Anybody want to know anything about me? Winters, tell Rabbi to contact me. God, I remember him as a little kid, but I wasn't that much older.
They lived in the house that I'm in for 9 years. The house that I'm in now is the house the Winters lived in.
When were they in that house for 9 years? Was that when I was there? Would I have been in that house?
I think so.
I remember the Winters and my dad being very good friends. I remember spending many time at their house.
Wow.
Yeah. And my sister Sarah and their daughter, I think, were very close too.
Sherry.
I recall Sherry. Yeah.
It's really nice that you came back to Winnipeg for the evening. And I guess one of the side benefits of this pandemic is that we don't have any borders anymore. It's like Bonnie was saying, for the medical profession, but also for us. We're able to host people who were connected in the past and haven't been back for a long time. So it's very special.
It is very special. And, when this is over, maybe you'll have me out for like a weekend or something, and we'll make a party out of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You'll come for a Shabbat across Winnipeg.
So
we'll just do it in the summer, not in February. Okay.
Well, you could come ice fishing,
Yeah.
okay, good
Paul
question
Shuckett.
here, right?
That's a name I remember.
Paul
Shukkett's asking, why are so many religious people not obeying?
Oh, by the way, I watched today on YouTube, it was a documentary that they were following this Hasidic singer. What's his name? Doesn't matter. But this person was not Jewish, came with a camera because this singer agreed to receive him, and he was living in this Hasidic neighborhood. So the person doing the interview came with a mask, right? Because it was during COVID. And then he said to the singer, well, I heard everybody in this neighborhood had COVID. Is that true? And then he said, yeah, we all had it. So he removed his mask. He said, I had it too. So I guess we are okay.
Look, all I know is that what I would say is that we Jews have our extremists as well. And those Jewish communities that are not paying attention to what's going on, they're just extremists. They think that God will provide, it reminds me of the joke of the flood. Right? Yeah. The flood's coming, the sheriff comes, he knocks on the door, the flood's coming, you have to leave. And the man says, I'm very religious, God will save me. So now the flood comes, he's on the second floor, the sheriff comes back, this time in a boat. He says, the flood is coming, if you don't get in the boat, you're going to drown. And the man says, God will save me, I've been pious my whole life, God will save me. Then finally, he's on the roof, and now the sheriff comes back with a helicopter, and he drops down a ladder. He says, if you don't get on the helicopter now, you're going to drown. To which the man says, God will save me. So what happens? He dies. He goes to heaven, and he's standing before God. He says, God, I've been pious, a religious Jew my entire life. Why is it you didn't save me? And God turns to the man, and he says, what are you talking about? First, I sent the sheriff. Then I sent him in a boat. Then I sent a helicopter. You got to meet me halfway. Right? These guys are.
Yeah, it was Lipa Schmelzer. Lipa Schmelzer was the singer.
Yeah. No, there's no logical religious reason for doing it. They're fanatics. We Jews have our fanatics too.
Yeah, I guess it's coming from, if you read the text from Leviticus, I think it wasn't Leviticus, yeah, the Kohen was the only one who was allowed to examine the leopard and to say tameh or tahor. And I believe when I studied that verse, it said specifically that even if a doctor tells you one thing, no, you should always listen to the Kohen.
I don't know of that, but look, as I said, for the Bible and for the rabbis, there's an ambivalency towards doctors because there's only so much they could do.
Yeah, but
that ambivalency doesn't exist today.
But I believe that if you go back to the verse, what actually means is you always listen to the expert. That was the spirit of the verse. Because at the time, the one who knew, because we always say that actually tzarat wasn't exactly leprosy, right? So the Kohen will know the difference. So to me, the teaching is you always should listen to the expert on the field.
Well, look, I mean, Kohanim, at the time of the Kohanim, the prevalent thought was that whatever happened to you was God's will. So the Kohanim were the experts, the intermediaries between human beings and God. And so that's why they were expert. It's not that they were medical experts, right? The Torah, the religion of the Torah is the religion of tameh and tahor, what's pure and what's impure in terms of how you approach God. And so having leprosy, having an emission, having some sort of illness would make you tameh, and you would be invalidated to approach God. So the Kohen's the only one that can certify you as being tahor, so that you can then bring your sacrifice and approach God. That's what they were concerned about. They were not medical experts, because there were no medical experts. So I don't think it's genuine to make that an analogy. But what we do know about Jewish life is that it does respect experts. It does respect learning. And if all things come from God, then all knowledge also comes from God. So therefore, science is also godly. And as Jews, certainly as normative Jews, we can distinguish between religious truth, which is about how to live an ethical, moral, purpose-driven life, and scientific truth, which is a different type of knowledge, right? The Torah and our religious texts are not scientific books. They're not history books. They're not fictional novels. They're religious texts. And they're all designed to tease out how we understand God's will in the world. And that's just a different type of thinking than science is. And so the two are not necessarily in contradiction with each other. They're different, which is one of the reasons why there are many, many scientists that are also religious people.
Albert Einstein, he said that the world couldn't exist if there wasn't a God.
Yeah. So in the Amidah, on the weekdays, we pray for Dea, Bina, and Heskel. The first bakasha, the first request that we make of God in the middle of the Amidah, first of the 13 middle brachot, is for knowledge. Now the first knowledge starts with the knowledge of God, because you can't have any kind of religious identity if you don't have knowledge of God. But we ask for three different types of knowledge: Dea, Bina, and Heskel. Da'at, Dea, is knowledge of like observable, factual knowledge. Bina is lahavin, is to be able to discern and differentiate between different things in the world. And Heskel is wisdom, which comes from experience. So our tradition, like 3 times a day, we're saying that we ask God to grant us knowledge, but not just knowledge, but Dea, Bina, Heskel. And so that impetus in our tradition for learning is why expertise, especially in times like this, matters. And it matters a whole lot. But the reality is, right, the reason why it's halacha l'maseh, the reason why you have a halacha for these circumstances, is that there's always political circumstances for it. And in democracies, we hold our leaders accountable for making the best decisions they can based on the evidence that they have. And some do it better than others. Look, I'm optimistic. We've never been in a circumstance in which we've developed a vaccine in as short a time as we have. That's because of the research that's been happening for the last 2 decades on mRNA. That's amazing, right? It's not a miracle, but it is miraculous. That's amazing. And if we can just figure out a distribution system, we'd be much better off. And last comment on this, same thing with food, right? The world produces 7 times more food than every human being in the world can eat. The problem is not in food production, it's in its distribution, which is man-made. So that's the same problem we have here. But God willing, we'll get there. Thank you both for this opportunity. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi, for your
I look forward to
teachings.
reconnecting.
It was so wonderful to be able to have this knowledge and to be able to discuss this important topic that's on everybody's mind. Rabbi Mass, I understand that we have another 2 sessions that will follow where you're bringing in your son, Marcelo.
Yeah, many people may remember him also. This similar situation with Rabbi Wernick here, because my son lived here in Winnipeg for a few years when he was little. I can't remember which grade 3, grade 4, and then he moved to Chile. But he's coming back almost as a doctor, but he's been studying medical alachat, he called it, for many, many years, combining his medical studies with yeshiva study. So we are going to continue the conversation. I think this is a great start. So thank you so much, Rabbi Wernick, for starting this conversation that I believe is important to have as Jews.
Thank you.
Thank you really for taking the time to come and be with us, because I know how busy you are, and it means a lot to us. It's very, very wonderful to have you. We have a few other programs coming up that I would just like to let you know about. We have next week on Thursday, we are partnering with Bridges for Peace, Emuna Israel, that feeds the poor. And we were talking about the importance of feeding the poor today. And also with Adas Yeshurun Herzliya Synagogue here in Winnipeg. And it's a challah bake and a Tu B'Shvat party on Thursday the 28th. And you need to sign up for this event. It's free and open to everybody. We also have a program for children, and it's a Zoom event. It's free, and you need to register for that. You can see on our website. Rabbi Mass offers a Torah L'chaim class every Thursday at noon, which is live streamed to Facebook and YouTube. And finally, we are bringing back Melton. Yes, Jewish denominations addressing the challenges of modernity. And this is with Patty Cohn, who's taught with us before for Melton. We are going to be starting on February 22nd, until the end of April. And this is going to be, I believe that's Tuesday from 4:30 to 6. And I'll just confirm that it is a Tuesday. Yes, no, it's a Monday, sorry. And you can register through our website. You'll be able to find all the information there. So lots of exciting things coming up. Thank you so much again to Rabbi Stephen Wernick and to Rabbi Mass for setting up this whole thing and for taking time to be with us tonight.
Thank you, Rina. Great pleasure to be here. It was great to learn from you, Rabbi Wernick. And thank you so much for everyone for being there. So remember, if you haven't done yet, remember to subscribe to our channels and then hit the bell so you will be notified every time we go live or every time we upload something to the internet. We love to be in touch with you. Thank you so much. Have a good night, stay safe, and hope to see you soon. Bye, everyone.